Hello, my babies. Hello, hello, hello. So today we are doing another Lofi video, and I am going to be reading you a book. I'm going to be reading first grade book. It's called Mr. Pine's Purple House. It's kind of long, but it's really, really old. This was my book when I was, a wee child. So when you open the book, this is what the first page looks like. It's a bunch of painting supplies. Let's just get started. Mr. Pine lived on Vine Street in a little white house. Mr. Pine lived on Vine Street in a little white house. A white house is fine, said Mr. Pine, but there are 50 white houses all in a line on Vine Street. How can I tell which one is mine? 50 houses all in a line on Vine Street. How can I tell which one is mine? He looked up and down the street. I know, said Mr. Pine. I will plant a tree, a little pine tree, by my house. Pine tree, Pine's house. See, that's me. That's what I will do, he said, and that's what he did. Mr. Pine's pine tree. Mr. Gold lived next door to Mr. Pine. What a nice little tree, said Mr. Gold. Mrs. Green lived next door to Mr. Gold. What a pretty tree, said Mrs. Green. They're all going to have pretty little pine trees soon. Pretty little pine trees soon. Pretty little pine trees soon. Mrs. Brown lived next door to Mrs. Green. What a very nice tree, said Mrs. Brown. The next day, Mr. Pine looked out of his window. He wanted to see his little pine tree, but what did he see? Mr. Pine wanted to see his pretty pine tree, but what did he see? He saw 50 white houses all in a line, and there was a little pine tree by each house. Oh no, said Mr. Pine. How can I tell which house is mine? 50 pine houses all in a row. All the houses all in a row. 50 pine houses all in a row with little pine trees. There were little pine trees. He looked up and down the street again. I know, said Mr. Pine. I will plant a big bush next to little pine tree. Big bush, pine tree, Pine's house. See, that's me. Big bush, pine tree, Pine's house. See, that's me. That's Mr. Pine. And he did. Then he did this and this. There, said Mr. Pine. That looks just fine. What a pretty bush, said Mr. Gold. Oh, how nice, said Mrs. Green. Very, very pretty, said Mrs. Brown. Here he is, planting. Gotta plant his bush. He's gotta plant his big bush. The next morning, Mr. Pine looked out of his window. He wanted to see his big bush by his little pine tree. But what did he see? There were 50 white houses all in a line. There were 50 little green trees, all of them pine. And next to each tree there was a big bush. A big bush, just like Mr. Pine's big bush. Big tree, big bush. He's got a little pine tree and a little big bush. He's got a big pine tree, a big pine tree, a little pine tree, a little pine tree, and a big bush. Oh no, said Mr. Pine, oh no. All the houses still look the same. Mr. Pine thought and thought. I know, said Mr. Pine. I will paint my house. He thought and thought some more. Let me see, he said. Red, yellow, orange, no. Blue, green, pink, let me see. I know. I will paint my house purple. Purple. Then off he went to get the paint. I will paint my house purple. I want to buy some paint, said Mr. Pine to Mr. Dash. I want to paint my house purple. Purple, asked Mr. Dash. Yes, purple, said Mr. Pine. Green is very nice, said Mr. Dash. No, said Mr. Pine. Red is very nice, said Mr. Dash. No, said Mr. Pine. White is very nice. No, 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 said Mr. Pine. I want purple paint. Purple paint, said Mr. Dash. Think of that. Well, for your house, you will need 9 big cans of purple paint. I will need some brushes, too, said Mr. Pine, and this, and this. And then I need something to mix the paint and clean the brushes. There's all his paint supplies right here. All his paint supplies. Paint. He's got paint. He's got paint his house purple. Mr. Pine's gonna have a great big Mr. Pine put everything into his truck. Back he went to Vine Street. He put his tall ladder here and his little ladder here. He put his tall ladder. His little ladder. Little ladder. I have things to do before I paint, said Mr. Pine. Mix and fix, fill this and sweep this. Mix, mix, mix. Now the paint is just right. Now I can paint. Then Mr. Pine went up to the ladder to the very top of the house. He began to paint. Squish, squish went the brush. Squish, squish, squish. Squish, 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 squish. Some boys were playing ball in the street, but Mr. Pine did not see them. A boy hit the ball. Up went the ball. Up, up, up. It was a home run. Look out, Mr. Pine, look out, the boys called, but Mr. Pine did not hear them. Pow! Down came the ball. Down came the ball on Mr. Pine's hat. Pow! Down came the brushes, down came the purple paint, down came Mr. Pine. They knocked him off his ladder. Down came the paint. Now I have to get more paint, said Mr. Pine. He went up the ladder again. Squish, squish with his brush. Squish, squish, squish. Then Mrs. Gold's cat ran under the ladder. Mr. Pine's dog ran after the little cat. Round and round they ran. Meow, 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 meow. The little cat ran up the ladder, but Mr. Pine did not see her. Mr. Pine came down the ladder, down on the little cat's foot. Little kitty cat, little kitty cat, little kitty cat. Down came the cat, down came the brushes, down came the ladder, down came the paint. Down came Mr. Pine. Pow! Everything fell, everything fell. Now Mr. Pine had purple grass, a purple cat, a purple dog, a purple hat, and a purple nose. Now I have to get more purple paint, said Mr. Pine. Up the ladder he went again. Squish, squish. Mr. Pine painted and painted until the house was all purple. Everybody on Vine Street came to look at Mr. Pine's purple house. No one had seen a purple house before. What a nice purple, said Mrs. Gray. I will paint my house. What a pretty purple house, said Mr. Gold. I will paint my house. What a very pretty house, said Mrs. Green. I will paint my house purple, too. Oh, no, no, said Mr. Pine. Not 50 purple houses all in a line on Vine Street. But I will paint my house pink, said Mrs. Gray. Yellow for me, said Mrs. Green. Green for me, said Mrs. Brown. I like red, Mrs. White said. And I will keep my house all white, said Mr. Gold. Now there are 50 houses on Vine Street. There are red houses and green houses and brown houses. There are yellow and pink houses, and there are some white houses too. But there is just one purple house on Vine Street, and that is Mr. Pine's purple house. Mr. Pine's purple house. The end. Did you guys like the story? So did you guys like the story? Did you like the story?